Welcome to the Jonathan_Foster podcast, a series of audio recording files where Jonathan engages with questions and concepts through the lens of Renee Chiard's mimetic theory and open and relational theology. And the important thing to keep in mind is that Jonathan has a doctorate now, which means he's leveled up his intelligence and commitment to give you some really helpful shit. It's season 5, and we're calling it Frequently Asked Questions. Make sure to like the show, leave a review, and sign up for Dr. J's newsletter at jonathanfosteronline.com. And now, our host, Dr. J, not the basketball one, the other one.
That's right, not the basketball one. Much to my disappointment. But that's all right, it's good to be with you. Hey, I hope you're choosing to do well today. Well, as best as it's in your ability to choose such things. I do know that there's no one in the world right now that's sitting around trying to figure out how to make your day go better. Well, I suppose you could be a celebrity or a CEO or a gangster. So if you're one of those folks, you probably got others who are interested in trying to make your day better. But by and large, no, your life is your life. You get to set the table in every moment. And in every moment, you get the past, you get options, you get agency. You get all three of those things happening moment by moment. Past, options, agency. So I hope you're choosing to do what you feel like you should be doing. Because you know what? I don't think God's interested in controlling you. I don't think God's interested in using you or has like one specific plan. I think there's a ton of directions that this thing could still go. So just go for it, man. Well, speaking of control, today's question has to do with relationships because I got a bunch of questions not long ago revolving around this topic. See, I think besides questions about the church, this is probably the largest group of questions that I received. So I piled them up. I read them again. I typed some of them into the internet to see what kind of questions might come up from other people. And then I formulated a plan. Yeah, that's what that all sounded like. And I feel pretty good about the way I boiled these down to really just one question that kind of runs two ways. Going the one way, it's how do I love and have honest conversations and be in relationship without falling prey to judgmentalism? And then number two, going the other direction, how do I love, be confident in myself, not sign up to be a doormat, even as I'm the one being judged? All right, then I was like, okay, what does Renee Chiard's mimetic theory or open and relational theology have to say about all of this? Because as you may know, I've spent a little bit of time wrestling with these venerable concepts. So I got a book coming out in the fall of 22, which, by the way, on the one hand, it doesn't really mean anything. I love the old adage, it's harder to live one day well than it is to write a book. I think there's some truth to that. However, I should also say that there are some folks like myself who spend years doing this stuff. And this current work, well, it's no exception. It will have been almost 3 years by the time that it comes out. 3 years of study, reading, getting up every morning, writing, and then getting people to read it. And in this case, obviously, running it by my doctoral mentor, who was Thomas Jay Oord, vetting it, reading it some more, writing some more, presenting to the board ultimately, and then more revisions and then copy editing. I mean, to do it well is a lot of work. So whoever said it's easier to live one day well than to write a book, well, I would just say it depends on the book. I suppose it depends on your definition of living well as well. And the stupid thing is, you do all of this, you have no idea if anyone's even going to be interested in it. It's not like I'm out there in the world figuring out which way the wind is blowing, trying to determine which topic is popular so that I could write about it so that it will sell. I mean, I suppose there are some people who do it that way, but that's not the way I'm wired. I am more of what might be called a discovery writer. I write to discover what I really think about something, to answer questions. It's like, it's like discovering a little trail in the middle of a forest, and I have to see where it goes. So I don't know if anyone else has to see where it goes. I don't know if anyone else is going to care or if it'll sell. Not to mention royalty rates even when it does sell. Honestly, it's all kind of maddening. Oh, well, but hey, you don't really care about that stuff, do you? Hey, Marcus, what do you think? Do you think people care about the lonely road of the writer?
I think the problem is you don't know if people are going to care about you talking, about whether people are going to care about your writing.
Yeah.
And the answer to both questions is you don't know. But I just heard you say in life you get the past, options, and agency.
So just go for it.
You just go for it.
That's true, Marcus. Thank you, man. I like that. That was good. Okay, hey, do you want to just recap the question for us and then I'll get started?
One question going two ways. How do I be in relationship without being judgmental? And how do I love, be confident in myself, not be a doormat, even as I'm the one being judged?
So as we talk about relationships, I want to reemphasize my general belief in the interconnectedness of all things. Now, this might sound a little bit redundant, like we're talking about better connection with others by framing and reframing our interconnectedness with everything. But I think there's something to consider here that in my pre-open and relational thinking days, I didn't really quite understand. I didn't really quite consider enough. So the move from modern to postmodern, the move that's roughly been made over the last 50 to 100 years, where we've moved from an understanding of, let's say, discreteness to continuity, from material to organic, from mechanistic to entanglement. Yeah, man, there are profound implications with that move. What science is telling us is that to get to life, for biological organisms to emerge, evolution didn't just subtract something here and then add something over there. It didn't just replace one part for another part. That would be a mechanistic way of looking at things. Life isn't built like a car. It's not like you can replace the parts. Furthermore, it's not like a car in that the parts aren't going to evolve into a better working car on their own. Something much more complex is going on with the ability for life to form as it has on our planet. Evolution had to work, so to speak, with certain substances, interacting with other substances to form something new. Maybe a better way of saying it is evolution is that process. It's a trajectory, the movement, the forward progress happening in the midst of entropy. There are reactions and responses and recycling. It's a relationship. So evolution doesn't go, oh, like the trees, they don't need oxygen, so we'll just get rid of it. No, evolution goes, oh, the trees don't need oxygen. I know some people who could use it. Or think about any symbiotic relationship. Like I was watching something about the ocean the other night, and they were showing these huge sharks with all these little fish that kept swimming around the sharks. But the big sharks didn't care about the little fish because they knew that the little fish helped them clean them and do those kinds of things. And the little fish benefited by being able to eat what was on the sharks and the leftover food when the sharks, had their big feast. It was this symbiotic relationship. Or think about, I don't know if you've seen the documentary Kiss the Ground. It's a really good show. I highly recommend it. But it's saying that essentially climate change can be connected to our topsoil. Like our topsoil really does a good job of containing a bunch of carbon. So the temperature of the earth depends upon the topsoil. Okay, what I'm trying to say is evolution is in the midst of all these things. It doesn't go, oh, the soil is just for, to do one thing. No, the soil can do a lot of things. It can contain carbon and it can help the planet. And I suppose the human brain can kind of grasp this when you think about any one of those particular examples. But evolution, of course, goes much, much further. It takes into account all of these examples. So you can wrap your mind around one thing, but evolution wraps its mind around the whole thing, such that the trees are related to the sharks and the oceans are related to the humans and the topsoil is related to tiny fish and the warming planet is related to oxygen. It's just an infinite combination of connections that are going on. Something novel about open and relational theology is that it says God's not independent from all of this connection stuff either. The divine is right in the midst of it all. Now, this isn't pantheism, it's panentheism for those of you who care about such things. But the idea is God's not separate. In fact, there is no separate. God isn't a foreign substance stepping out of time and space in order to order our world. And then, of course, only to leave, go somewhere else, show up from time to time, including the end of the story when he comes back to extract his people and then blow the world up. That's certainly not the story. So God didn't come from nothing because there is no nothing. The only thing that comes from nothing, as the old saying goes, is nothing. And neither the rabbinic nor the early Christian tradition attaches emptiness or nothing to the story that begins to emerge out of Genesis chapter 1. And probably my favorite Hebrew phrase, tohu vabohu, which I always say it wrong, I'm sure. But in Genesis 1:2, it's that phrase that we commonly translate as formless and void. But it's really chaos and wildness and potential. It's a lot of other stuff packed in there. It might mean nothing in the sense that it's not a thing, but not nothing in the sense that literally nothing exists. Because even a vacuum is said to be empty. And yet the quantum physicist notes a certain fluctuation of energy even within that vacuum. I mean, it might be microscopic, but something is there. Therefore, when the physicist speculates about what was happening at the Big Bang, she might label it a quantum field of nothing. Space isn't empty. Something comes from other somethings. Of course, all of this says something about the divine as well. Let's see. I don't imagine God came from something, though some do, by the way. But I don't imagine God came from something. Rather, I imagine God is a necessary being. God just is, has always been, and will always be. So I don't want to get into all the metaphysical speculation that all of that entails right now. But I guess I'd just say it this way. It seems to me that life is most plausible because there is something or someone inviting it to be. And within that invitation, there's a response. And so creation emerges. So there is no creation without God. But what's novel with open and relational thinking is that you could also say that there is no God, at least as we know God, without creation. First, because without creation, there's no way to imagine a God, so the whole point becomes abstract and, becomes pointless. Second, because creation influences God, puts God in a vulnerable position. So if God is love, then love can be affected. So God is different now because of his love for you than he was before you showed up. Just like my wife and I are different because of having children. In Alfred North Whitehead terms, we might say that God's primordial nature never changes, but his consequent nature does change. It has to change because of love. So in other words, we might say that what's unchanging is that God is love, but what changes is how God loves. I'm attenuating my desire to talk about 100 different things here so that I can stay on track with at least the one point I want to make. And that is that if all this is true, that we have a relational cosmos and a relational God, it subverts all forms of hierarchy and power. This is the opposite of what Christianity in the West has bought into. We bought into power. We bought into imperialism. We still do. You heard anyone in politics recently talking about the Christian Nationalist Party? Yeah, it's still very much a part of our agenda. Now, there's a lot going on here, and I'm not going to get into all the details, but all of this stems from our determination, our decision, our choice to see God as something as separate, bigger than us, in control, strong and powerful, something that cannot be influenced or affected. A lot of this comes from Plato, more specifically Aristotle, who talked about power and unmoved movers. And then theologians picked up on that. So you got guys like Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologica. Marcus, what did he say again?
It is necessary to arrive at a first mover, put in motion by no other. And this everyone understands to be God.
Okay, so everyone understands God is the first mover. And then everyone understands that creation came along after at some point in time, despite Genesis not necessarily saying that. Genesis was saying God was interacting with the formless and void stuff, not necessarily that God created the formless and void stuff. Now, this doesn't mean God's not powerful. It's just that it's a different kind of power. It's a relational power. It's a consensual power. A God consenting to be in relationship with the tohu vabohu, the quantum of nothing, the formless and void. It was already happening. It was already there, and God's entering into it. This is different than an authority-driven power, where God has to step in from somewhere else, some other time, some other space, and flex his omnipotent muscles to make it happen. You see, Genesis doesn't really tell us when stuff began, and it certainly doesn't tell us when time began. What it seems to tell us is that in the beginning, something was already going on. But following Aquinas, who was following Aristotle, theologians essentially ran wild with capital O, omnipotence. It's a word, by the way, that doesn't appear in the Bible. That's probably for another story, but at this point, it becomes a signifier of a word, signifying all kinds of things about the power of God and control and people's assumption about what power is, and essentially how God single-handedly decides everything for all time. Well, open and relational theology says, not quite, not really. It's not the healthiest way to view God as this unmoved mover completely separate from everything else, because nothing can be separate. Secondly, God's not interested in being the strongest, most powerful, in being controlling, because God is love. Love doesn't control. And I go a step further with people like Tom Oord, and I say that love can't control. I think the fundamental characteristic of love is consent. Therefore, God is in a consensual relationship with everything in the cosmos. And so the question has been posed, how do I love, be in relationship without being judgmental? Well, one way to respond is to recognize that really there's no hierarchy here. There's no, well, I've got the answer because I have the power, so I get to look down upon others and decide what, the best response is. That doesn't mean that there aren't some answers that are better than others, which all points to the possibility of value that exists in the world. But it's a relational cosmos. So the pressure of finding a position of strength so that one can provide the right answer, which, by the way, usually serves to reinforce our positions of strength, that pressure, it's been eliminated. God doesn't even feel that pressure. God's not forcing things, making things happen. God is, so to speak, in the flow. Now, I believe she's exerting her influence. I believe she has strength. I believe she's capable of inviting people into good choices and possibility of value to actualize love. But God doesn't control. And so the follower of love could emulate God. Or, think about it this way. If your God is uninterested in judging and controlling, you'll be uninterested in judging and controlling. Reflect upon these things. Meditate on this idea. Consider love. the power of love, the power of consent. Consensual energy is patient. It doesn't keep track of wrongdoing. It doesn't boast. It doesn't envy. It looks for truth. It doesn't give up. You are an image bearer of your God. You're like an icon, a sign. When people are around you, they're going to notice which God you reflect. There's a lot of gods. There's a whole bunch that want you to be selfish and judgmental and controlling. I think that what I think is that there's only one God, love, that longs for you to be patient. So how do we love and be in relationship without falling prey to being judgmental? Well, number one, do your best to get this kind of God into your life, a consensual God, a God who really cares about others. Number two, you're going to have to put practices in your life to help that kind of God flourish in your life. Which means you might have to change some things up. If you go to a church that's constantly putting you in a position where you are othering people, where you have to see them as bad in order to see yourself as good, honestly, it's probably time to find a new church. Or like if Bible reading is making you angry or frustrated or encouraging you to pray prayers where you ask God to take control, to use circumstances, to use you, to reveal his one true plan. You know, these kinds of things. I'd say stop reading your Bible because I don't think that that's healthy. I don't think that that's promoting love. The fundamental characteristic of love is consent. So you're going to have to change your practices. You're going to have to think about that. And really only you can determine the best way to go about that. So you're aligning yourself with a God who doesn't control. You know, you're meditating upon love. You're trying to put good and healthy practices into play into your life to reinforce this kind of thinking. And you're doing your best to turn from judgmentalism and, frustration over others and wanting to control others. I think another thing you have to do is be realistic, which means you are going to have to draw boundaries in your life around certain people. There are going to be some people that will stir up your judgmentalism. And of course, when that happens, you're going to want to try to evaluate what that says about you, what that says about them. Usually it's about a combination of things at play between the two of you in the community at large, because we live in a mimetic relational cosmos. There's a multiplicity of things that are going on. But sometimes you're just going to have to determine, you're going to determine that you just can't carry on like you have. And so then you say, look, I'm going to draw some lines here. I'm not going to get any closer to this person because it's really stirring up a lot of unhealthy stuff. Let me share with you a little personal thing that happened to me a long time ago. It was in another city, in another situation. I had a relationship with these two guys who were a part of my faith community. And I guess I would say I never quite felt comfortable around them. Something always felt a little bit off, not between them necessarily, but between them and me, I would say so. And I thought that I noticed it between them and others as well. But given that I was trying to practice what I've already been talking about here, like stay away from being impatient, stay away from controlling ideas, reject judgmentalism and those kinds of things, I just did my best to incorporate them into my life. Unfortunately, over time, they just kept doing what it is that they do, which is, I don't know, they just kind of got their claws into other people's lives, into my life, and began to exert their control and their manipulation. Like they would give me gifts when I wouldn't even want gifts. They'd promise more gifts, even though I didn't want more gifts or I didn't ask them, and I definitely didn't ask for their promises. And then if I had an idea to do about something, they'd get upset if I didn't ask them. If I was leading something, then they'd assume I was just supposed to listen to their ideas and implement their ideas. And they'd call me whenever they wanted. And the relationship just kind of grew and grew more dysfunctional. And there are some extenuating circumstances as to why I wound up kind of letting it go as long as I did. For one, I hadn't matured to the point to recognize, when these red flags crop up, that I just need to draw the boundary as soon as I decide that it's probably healthy. And number two, I was coming through the middle of a really intense time of, loss and antagonism and a lot of questions. I won't go into detail now, but during that time in our family, we had had a fire and we'd had a murder. And then one of my best friends from college had passed away. It was just a combination of things that kind of left me really open and somewhat vulnerable. And so, I was playing with all this stuff and trying to work through the relationship. And it was during this time also that I was a pastor. And when you're a pastor, drawing boundaries is really difficult because you don't want to be mean. You don't want to act as if your life is more important than others. On Sundays, you preach about being selfless and then to come back during the week and draw lines that might make you look selfish. That's hard. And you definitely don't want to get people angry because A, you already have enough angry people. And B, when unhealthy, angry people start to get carried away, they can say all kinds of things to people. And even though it's just a flood of empty words, you also know you got to process these empty words with more and more people because the larger community always gets pulled into the mess. And even though you don't really mind helping the larger people grow, the larger group grow into better people to help them gain insight and truth, you know that this entire thing is just a fabrication. It's just blown up out of proportion. It's just a problem that the original people started. And I don't have a problem telling you that I don't need to waste my life putting out fires that an angry, insecure, immature group of people initiated. I'll walk through problems with people, but if you're angry and insecure and controlling and you're the one initiating these problems, I don't think it's my responsibility to help you for very long. I was so frustrated at these guys. I couldn't even have compassion for them during a particular season. It just got so crazy. Phone calls after sermons, wondering why I was preaching at them, questioning on how the board was running things when they had no idea what was going on. So finally, I just made a decision. And then, and I think this part is important, I vetted the decision with my wife, my therapist, a group of people online I had used with conflict resolution in the past, a board member, and also my lawyer, because it was getting that crazy. I prayed and I thought and I reflected, and then I took a couple of really long hikes to make sure I was thinking clearly. And then afterwards, I intentionally drew up very hard and fast boundary lines. Now, here's the thing. I knew what could potentially happen. All manner of hell breaking loose. But once I made the decision, it really didn't matter because that was it. I was self-selecting out a relationship, and if they had a problem with it, then it was on them. I was no longer responsible for their behavior, as if I ever was. And of course, I'm leaving out a bunch of stuff, but I had tried to communicate these things all along the way. It's not like I just went from 0 to 60. There was a whole process of things before we got to this point. Anyhow, so I made the decision. And what was kind of crazy is I made the decision out of a sense of conviction, doing what was right. But during those 3 weeks when I was really reflecting about it, mostly, honestly, I was just driven by being fed up. I was driven mostly by a type of anger and frustration and utter disbelief in the way that they were manipulating things and abusing me. It was really only after I made the decision where I was able to separate myself, gain some space and given myself some time away from these guys that I really began to feel compassion for them. And I thought that was interesting. Now, all of this was corroborated several years later when I heard Brene Brown talking about boundaries and talking about how, when you're in the moment, you're not really capable of feeling compassion for others because everything is just too subjective. It's just too close. And so there's no room for anger and compassion to exist together. No room for your feelings of injustice and feelings for your other person. So in other words, it's the boundaries that help you gain compassion. Now, she was using the word compassion. I've been talking about judgmentalism. I think these terms are synonymous in this context. Either way, it's being separate from the problem that helps you foster an attitude of being able to, gain some clarity and not be judgmental. Yeah, I think it's true. This has been my lived experience on more than one occasion. Now, I'm grateful to say that today, when I think about these particular people, I don't think about them with malice or anger. When I think of them, I feel for them. Now, we're not in relationship. We never will be, but I don't hate them. And a part of the reason I don't hate them is because of the boundaries. If I hadn't set the boundaries, I probably would hate them. So I'm trying to say develop practices, behaviors, action-oriented things that help you emulate love. And when you do, you'll probably have to set some boundaries. Now, the astute listener might be listening and thinking, wait a minute, I thought you said that love was consensual. If love is consensual, can it set boundaries? And this is a very good question. It's something I've wrestled with quite a bit. It's a bit complex, and you have to kind of approach it from a few different ways. So I do think that God is love, and I do think that love is consent. Therefore, God allows or has to give freedom for creation to make choices. But also God's consensual love is done from a context where she doesn't have a physical, localized, corporeal body. God is spirit. So it makes it challenging to conceive how this works. So we obviously do have bodies. And so we're invited to love as God loves without control in consent. But then you go like, well, what about danger and pain and violence? What are we going to do? Do we consent when someone is trying to hurt us or manipulate us or use us as a doormat? And the short answer to that is no. But I'm not going to say it's not complex. So this is where I think the life of Jesus becomes so compelling and interesting and important. Because I think he personifies love. He embodies love as well or better than anyone who's ever lived. And what's interesting is there were definitely boundaries with Jesus. I mean, there's several examples. Here's a couple of them. I think one, he had boundaries around his family. If you read the Gospels, it's clear that at times his family wasn't too excited about what he was doing, about what he was talking about. But he did it anyhow. In fact, there's one point in the gospel stories where a group of people come to him and they say, hey, your family's outside. They're coming to get you. They want you to leave. And he says, who is my family? He clearly put boundaries around that. He also put boundaries around when he would be hurt. Like in Nazareth, after sometimes we reference it as his first sermon. I mean, the people hated the sermon so much, they wanted to throw him off a cliff, which should make any preachers listening feel better about, what they did last Sunday. I mean, they took Jesus and they wanted to throw him off a cliff because they didn't like what he said. But the text says he slipped away through the crowd. In other words, I think what we can gain from this is that Jesus was setting some boundaries. He was like, no, I'm not going to let the crowd throw me off the cliff right now. This isn't the time to give my life for something. So this embodiment of love, he lived a very interesting life where, yes, he was giving himself away for people, but he was also very intentional about it. And it seems to grow and mature and ebb and flow. I don't get the sense that he was just out there with no borders or boundaries, completely giving himself away to the point of exhaustion until, of course, he did do that. And then his life, it culminates in the week of the crucifixion week. But I don't think he was there because he had lost all control. Even with Pilate standing in front of him saying, don't you know I have the power? Jesus is essentially saying, no, not really. You don't have the power. I could change the course of this thing right now if I wanted to. And so he dies because he chose to step into that role in order to identify with all of those who've died because they've had no influence over the victimizing roles that they were forced into. Yeah, so something interesting is going on here with Jesus. Like he's able to live within this oppressive context that wound up scapegoating him, but he never seems to lose his autonomy and his agency. And there's something about all that I find really compelling, and I'm trying to learn from it. And I think consent has a lot to do with it. Well, I know I need to bring it back to the question about how to love without being judgmental. And I hope I've given you some stuff to think about. I mean, first of all, you're trying to align yourself with an uncontrolling love. Like, see that as your God. Meditate upon that. Put practices in place in your life that help you be infused with that. Wrestle with forgiveness, secondly, but don't be afraid to create boundaries around certain people. I mean, you don't have to make a big deal about it. Well, maybe you do have to make a big deal about it. Maybe that's part of the point. But either way, listen to yourself. Thirdly, we haven't really talked about this yet, but I think it's just important to be able to own your own culpability. You would be shocked at how many people, or maybe you wouldn't be, at how many people in our universe are incapable or unwilling is probably the right word to admit their own culpability. So if this is a relational universe, the person that you are wanting to judge, those feelings, they might be emanating from you as much as from the behavior of the other person. Girardian ideas have helped me as much as anything in this area, because in a mimetic relational universe, and mimetic comes from the word mimesis, which means imitation. Obviously, you imitate in a relational context. If it wasn't relational, there would be no one to imitate. In a mimetic relational universe, I have to recognize that my own agitation exists in part because I have anxiety about myself, and in an effort to rid myself of that anxiety, I wind up projecting it onto others. Then by judging them, I can judge myself. It's probably true to say that I'm never more irritated at someone than when I see something about myself that I don't like in the other person. So in learning how to not judge others, I've grown better at not judging myself and vice versa. I genuinely think there are a lot of good people in our churches and in our communities who've just never been able to get over their own judgmental feelings for themselves, over their own mistakes, their own shortcomings. So giving yourself grace allows you to give grace to others. I think the old adage is true here. You can't give what you don't have. Now, sometimes you learn grace by being around other people. They give it to you. So I don't know that it always works that way, because grace can't quite be defined as rigidly as I would like. But I think as a rule, the more you can give it to yourself, the more you'll be able to give it away. Giving yourself grace is giving yourself the space to step back and say, no, this relationship, it's just not good for me, which allows you to be non-judgmental. But it also does something else. When you stand up for yourself, you're reinforcing or reminding yourself about the power of consent. You're the one, ultimately, that has to decide what is right for you. You get to decide. God's not forcing you because love doesn't force. Approaching life this way, I think, builds autonomy. And I'm convinced that this is something that love desires. Love doesn't need you to, die to your will or sacrifice yourself or trade in all your dreams for God's dreams, which are all the kinds of things that I heard in church life over the years. Yes, love will invite you into challenging situations where you might choose to do some things that approximate those phrases, but love doesn't need you to do any of them. Love doesn't need you to do anything. Consent is about agency. Agency can help you not be a doormat, to not take on those judgmental feelings that you sense others projecting upon you. Of course, you're going to have to wrestle with mercy and forgiveness in the middle of all this, but I'm convinced that God is with you as you make those decisions and does not need you or long to control you to force you down one particular path. I know these things are tricky, but don't be afraid to stand up to the crowd. Well, I say don't be afraid. Actually, it's not like we never get over our fear. So the phrase don't be afraid is not a denial of our fear. I think it's to name that, we do have some reservation about what's going on, but to be strong and to move forward even in the midst of all of that. Maybe you're not someone who loves confrontation. Actually, I'm not sure I know anyone who loves confrontation. So just take baby steps. Maybe you can't stand up to the crowd. Maybe first you stand up in the crowd. Maybe you can't disrupt the flow. Maybe first you need to just interrupt the flow. Take a small step. make a small move to detach from the wave of judgmentalism that you feel coming at you. Maybe in Jesus standing up against the mob as they drug that adulterous woman, so to speak, to his feet. Maybe you would find in him a model, someone to emulate. He clearly wasn't going to go the direction of the crowd. The crowd wanted him to do a particular thing. I think Nietzsche was right when he judged Christianity during his time to be the religion of the crowd, to have like a herd mindset. I think that's probably true of Christianity in many respects today, but not the real Christianity. I think Nietzsche is wrong in not recognizing the veracity of what Jesus was doing, what Jesus was showing us, giving us someone and something to imitate that would just help us stand up in the crowd. So stand up, stand tall, slow down, respond rather than react, encourage rather than shut down, activate grace rather than shame. Do it for yourself and do it for others. I came across some of the work of Valerie Kaur recently. I'm not sure that's even how you pronounce her last name. But she has this great quote. She says, "Listening does not grant the other side legitimacy. It grants them humanity and preserves our own." Sheesh, that's so great. It's so true. If you were to exchange the word listening for grace, that's the whole thing. Or actually, just keep listening in, because a lot of times grace is a type of listening, being aware of the good things that are going on in life. Grant that to others. It grants them humanity, and it preserves your own life all the way along. Well, thanks for being with me. I caught up with my good friend Derrick Logan recently. I'm not even sure we talked about relationships, but we talked about a bunch of stuff, which tends to happen when he and I get together. Derrick's doing some really interesting work, working with folks who are, we might loosely call in that post-evangelical space, kind of trying to figure out what's next and still interested in moving forward in love, but not exactly sure they can still do it in dogmatic, really churchy kind of circles. So I love my conversation with him. You can find the entire thing on my Patreon page. Just search for Jonathan_Foster. Here's a bit of that conversation before we conclude.
English, Latin-based languages, like there's a lot of verbs. In Hebrew, it kind of describes the dynamic and the movement of things as opposed to like the physical reality of things. And it's all of these things. And then biblical Hebrew is really fascinating because there's only, there's a few 100,000 words in the English language. In biblical Hebrew, there's only a few thousand words. And so a single word actually means multiple things. And those things are, the word compassion, rahum, also it is the word for womb. And so it's not a coincidence that this is the same word, but if you want to understand what compassion is, the image of that is a womb, right? And it's like, I never really thought about compassion in that sort of way. Like a woman surrounding this life that's inside of her and providing everything for this living thing that it can't provide for itself.
Find that conversation at Dr. J's Patreon page. All right, we done.